Remember the story of how the earth came to be? Today I'm going to tell you the story of the coming of life, of the plants, the animals, and us, the human beings. So go back with your mind to the time when the earth was born as a tiny little drop of light and heat, of commotion and confusion. And yet, in this little drop, every particle was given a set of laws so that when the earth cooled, everything settled down according to these laws. There was water, the rocks, and surrounding them all the air. The earth looked like a beautiful little pearl. The sun looked at this beautiful little pearl. It liked it. And it looked at it day and night because it was so beautiful. One day the sun saw that something was not quite right. Something was beginning to happen. There was trouble. It rained a lot on this earth, and as the water passed through the air, it got mixed up with the gas. All of this rain and gas was washing away the rocks, making the sea full of all kinds of salts. There were also a lot of storms breaking up the rocks. The sea was becoming fuller and fuller, and the land was being washed away. It looked as though once again the order that had been created was beginning to break up. Who was causing this? The sun looked at the water, and the water said, "Who, me? What have I done? I am made in such a way that if I become hot, I disappear. If I become cool, I fall down. And being a liquid, I have to go into cracks. So what can I do? It is that silly sister air. She stirs me up. It is her fault." Air said, "Me? I like that. I was given the job of covering the earth with layers and layers of blankets so that she won't be cold. But she has a cold head and cold feet. I have to be always on the run to warm her. And what does that water do? A silly thing. She jumps on my back and takes a ride. It is all right when it is flat, but when there are mountains, I have to climb up. She's very heavy and I have to drop her. I cannot play all the time. I have serious work to do. If you ask me, it is all the fault of those rocks. They are so full of wrinkles and bubbles. They have no consideration at all. They don't even move an inch to let me pass. On top of that, sometimes they are freezing, so passing next to them, I have to cringe. And sometimes they are so hot that I have to climb up to avoid burning. The rocks started to protest. "Blame us, will you? We are not doing anything but sitting around. It is not our fault if we get hot. Do you think we want to get hot? When the sun shines upon us, we cannot help it. We get hot. What can we do? We are made that way. If you ask me, it is your fault, son. You are the culprit." And so it went on. All of them were right, of course. Everyone was behaving just the way it had been made. And yet, order was being threatened and something had to be done. What could be done? So then, something else was created. A tiny little drop of jelly, so tiny that you could not even see it. And to this tiny drop of jelly, God said, "I give you something no one else has had. I give you sensitivity. In order to exist, you must eat and grow. But all of you will not eat the same thing. You will have the power to create others like you. This is your specialty. So then, life came in the form of these tiny little drops of jelly, each of whom had these laws to follow. Eat, grow, and create others like yourselves. They were like tiny little machines, and they made other tiny little machines by splitting up. It was as if you had a car, and after a while it split up into two little cars, then grew, and after a while split, and so on. Through these little drops of jelly began the work of cleaning up the sea. As they fed upon the salts of the water, they built their own bodies with them. Some of them found the water itchy, so they built shells to protect themselves. When they died, these tiny shells dropped to the bottom of the sea, and the salts remained trapped in these tiny shells. As time passed and these creatures lived and died, layer upon layer of this new kind of mud piled up at the bottom of the sea like a book, the book of the earth. Some of these pages have remained for us to read later on, so we could tell what happened a very long time ago before anyone was born. These first tiny creatures were made up of just one cell, which did all this work: breathing, eating, getting rid of what they did not want, and drifting around in the seas, cleaning up the water. Then as time went on, some of them seem to have said, why not join together? Because then we can be even more efficient. We can do things better. Along came slightly bigger creatures, made out of several cells. They too went on feeding in the water of the seas, growing and creating others like themselves. This went on for a long time until some of them seem to have thought that instead of each of their cells doing the same thing, why not give to certain cells only one job to do? So some cells were lined up and told, you do the eating, you do the breathing. And still others were told, you better be in charge of moving us around. And so came creatures with arms, or legs, or mouths, or hearts, creatures with organs. And when the book of the earth opened up, the first pages that we can read, as it were, all these types of creatures were already there. So we see the book of the earth opening up. Here we begin to see some of the life forms. We see an amoeba here, just one-celled animal. Here we see another one-celled animal with flagellate to move about. Here we see the sea anemones, and here we see the trilobites. One animal of which these were a lot were actually the trilobites. They were like lobsters of our time, but they are no longer with us. They were of many sizes, some very big and some small. Look at the small ones, some of them so big. But they have all disappeared. As time went on, all kinds of animals appeared. All kinds of experiments went on. So these cephalopods, for example, had their legs attached to their heads. These look like flowers. Got them? They look like flowers, but they are not flowers at all, but stone houses built by jelly-like creatures. Look at them. They are not flowers. They took salt out of the sea and built up these stone houses. They had been called the sea lilies. When they died, the tree of rings collapsed and lay at the bottom of the sea. The water was full of all these different types of life. Among these were also some creatures who, instead of eating other creatures, made their own food. They did this with the salts of the water and sunlight. They too drifted around the sea, and at some point, some of them decided to see what it was like outside of the sea. Floating with the tides, they got carried to the edge of the sea, and they remained until the tides returned. They found out that the air outside of the water was full of a gas that they could make use of for their food. So they remained there at the edge of the seas, feeding themselves. And when they died, their bodies remained for preparing the ground for others to come. For the first time, life was trying out the land. Gradually, these are the ones who developed into plants. While there was going on at about the same time, two new types of animals appeared in the sea. One was to help the building of the land. Those were the corals. And the other was a strange little animal with rod inside. Until now, if the animal had any shell, it was on the outside, but this one had a rod inside. It was the beginning of animals with bones. In time, this animal developed into the first fish. They were very different from the fish of our day. Once this experiment became a success, a great variety of fish appeared. They were very different from the fish as we know today. Some were big with great armors for protection. Look at this one. So big. They will remain buried in the mud and catch other animals as they passed by. Then what happened? Slowly, over a period of time, the land started to rise. And it closed off the sea. At some places with no rain, the land began to dry up. If you need water for your life and it dries up, what can you do? You must solve the problem. The fish trapped in these places had to figure out something in order to go on living or die out. Some said, I am going to make a little sack inside my body and line it with water. That way I will be able to breathe without water. They discovered the secret of breathing outside of water. Here came the amphibians. Here came some other animals that live partly in water and partly on land. The amphibians. The fins became useless. As you see them here, became useless. Rather than that, they developed legs to walk on land. Animals like frogs and salamanders appeared. With them came the sound of the first voice on earth. The silence, except for the sound of falling rocks or rain, was broken. There was now the voice of the frog. The amphibians enjoyed their life on land. For there were also plants. They were growing fast and in great variety, so the amphibians had plenty to eat. There were a lot of insects around. There was just one little problem. Because of the way their skins were made, they needed to stay near water. Also, for laying their eggs, they needed water. Some of them began not to like it. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to go further on the land. So what did they do? They developed a skin that did not dry out, not even under the sun. For their eggs, they invented a shell. The new kinds of animals that came out of this experiment were the reptiles. With this new kind of skin that did not dry out and eggs that did not have to be laid in water, they could move about much more freely and they went much further into the land. This was new ground. Nobody was there to stop them. The reptiles became almost like the lords and masters of the land. They invaded everywhere, even the air. They grew and grew, and they had bony skeletons to support the weight of their muscles. Some of them grew to enormous sizes. Look at this one. Can you imagine how big that was? His head was bigger than a human being's. Look at the human being. Look at the size. You can see the difference between his huge body, this huge reptile, and the man. He was so big that he had to have a little brain here and another brain here. This is because the tail was so far away from the brain in the head that the creature could not even know if his tail was beaten up. So it had to have a second brain here, apart from the brain here in the head. Look at this one. Can you imagine? Look at this one. Can you imagine these animals when they had a fight, how the earth must have trembled? Look at how big this one is. Look at, compared with the size of a man. As these huge reptiles moved around the land, other smaller animals had little chance to survive. Some of them fled to places these reptiles did not go. These were the colder regions, and they remained there. As they were small animals, they needed only a small amount of food, and many of them raided the eggs of the reptiles that were left around. For some of the reptiles did not care about their eggs. They just laid them and went away. As time went on, these animals developed something to protect their skin and to keep them warm. They developed fur or feathers and warm blood. These were the birds and mammals. Yeah, so the birds and the mammals, they developed fur and feathers. What about their eggs? They did not want to leave their eggs around like some of the other reptiles did. So they carried them around inside their bodies. These were the mammals. You see them here. The birds could not keep them inside because they had to fly around. So they built nests and sat upon them to keep them warm. When the little ones hatched, they fed and gathered them, sometimes with their lives. The mammals kept the little ones inside until they were ready to come out. And when they were born, the mothers fed them with milk. That was very new. Most of the reptiles did not do this. They left their eggs to hatch on their own. Once they hatched, they had to look for their own food and often were eaten by other animals. The parents of mammals and birds stayed with their young until they could take care of themselves. If anyone came to eat the babies, the parents took care of them. This was a new way of caring. Most of the reptiles did not do this. By the time these new animals had arrived, the weather had begun to change again. It grew steadily colder, and the reptiles, who had no feathers or fur or warm blood, could not stand the cold and began to die out. The mammals took over. With enough food around, it was their own turn to grow big. There were giant pigs and elephants with enormous tusks. The weather continued to become colder and colder until large sheets of ice covered almost the whole earth. In the end, none of these giant animals survived. But then something exciting happened. Towards the end of this very cold period, a completely new type of being appeared. It did not have fur like some of the other animals. Neither did it have any huge teeth or big claws, but it has something which none of the others had. It had a much larger brain with the power to think, imagine, and to reflect. It also had enormous amount of love. That was so different that this creature was no longer just an animal. This was a human being. With human beings, love went beyond their own children. It went to others of their kind, even to those men, women, and children they would not even ever see. It was as though the earth had to have this long preparation time to make it ready for this special creature. If human beings had appeared in any of the previous ages, it would not have been possible for them to live. But now everything was ready. If the earth had a voice, she would have said, I have spread thick carpets of grass so that your feet can walk on soft ground. I have put flowers in my hair and covered myself with jewels. My cupboards are full of milk and honey, meat and vegetables. Down in the cellars there is coal and iron. Now that all have been made ready, it is time for you to come. That is my story for you today.